He will be in conversation with Krishnan Srinivasan, a retired Indian diplomat, historian, not a retired historian, a retired Indian diplomat, currently a historian, author, former Indian Foreign Secretary, and Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations. He has won several honors and has written a series of books about a spy called Marco. So I hand over to uh, Ambassador Srinivasan, or to some of us, Chris Uncle.
Thank you very much, Malavika. More extinguished ambassador rather than anything else. But anyway, thank you, Mukund. Very good to see you here with your book. Let's get straight into it. Now, flap. Flap, I think, is English slang. I think you might have to explain why you use that word in your title, and also give us a feeling of what's in the book.
Okay, just want to first start by thanking Gopal for his extraordinarily generous appreciation, and thank you, Malvika, for having me here. It's great to be here. Yes, the flap was a term used. The Great Flap, in fact, was a term used by British bureaucrats to describe the panic and the during that time. Uh, so I keep getting asked what the book is about, and you know, by friends, and I find it's one of the hardest questions to answer. So let me try and do it as succinctly as I can. Uh, the book principally, it spans other periods, but principally spans a period between late December 1941 and mid 1942. So that's the period it covers. Um, you might say that it begins with the Japanese assault on Malaya, which was held synchronously with Pearl Harbor, and ends in about April and May 1942, when the Japanese fleet that came to bomb Sri Lanka, Colombo, and Trincomalee, and then bomb Vishakhapatnam and Kakinada as well, and created some havoc by sinking merchant ships in the Bay of Bengal, retreated because they had a challenge from the Americans in the Pacific. So that's the period. And the book says two or three things. One is that the extent of the panic in India and the scale of the exodus has been largely unmapped. Um, very conservatively, 75% of Madras fled. I think the number was probably around almost 90%. I think there's a good reason to believe that. Um, we know that Vishakhapatnam emptied out. We know that Calcutta, for instance, 17% of Calcutta fled in 17 days in late December 1941. Um, we also know that the flap touched all kinds of places: Delhi, Bombay, Ahmedabad, Jamshedpur, even Kodaikanal. So the exodus of people is something that, uh, I began as a book on Madras, but the more I researched it, I found that it was pan Indian. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is the governments themselves disbanded themselves in certain places. We know that the Madras government scattered all over the presidency. What people don't know, or what people don't know as well, is that uh, there was so much panic in Cuttack that they moved the capital of Orissa to Sambalpur. The secretariat in Cochin moved inland to Trishur. So this was a time when all kinds of things were happening, and I tried to make out a case that that story has got somewhat lost. And I also attempt to analyze the impact of that period on the nationalist movement, because I think the war had a tremendous impact, particularly on the Congress.
The curious thing, isn't it, that not only the coastal regions, but also inland towns evacuated. Now, why would they do that, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's not clear, for instance, I mean, why there was what the chief commissioner of Delhi described as an exodus, but I don't know how many people went. But he seemed to suggest that the numbers of people who fled, he says in one communication, were exaggerated, but he still calls it an exodus. But we know um, that in Jamshedpur, there was a fear that the Tata Steel plant, which is sponsoring our fest, was going to be hit. So workers left the plant in great numbers. And then because it was the largest steel-making plant in the British Empire, uh, anti-aircraft guns and all kinds of other measures were moved in. And so the workers got scared that something was about to happen. And so there was an exodus from Jamshedpur. In Kodaikanal, there was an exodus of white people. I mean, the missionaries went into panic, and the American missionaries, and they fled in large numbers. So in different places, there were different reasons, but the point is that the panic was pan-Indian.
And certainly, I think it showed the British Raj in a very bad light. It showed them as being unable really to manage the information flows, and there was a lot of mixed messaging from New Delhi, probably from the governors also in the various states. So it was a general um, atmosphere of disorder, and that didn't bode well for the Raj.
True. Uh, that's one side of the story. The other side of the story I discovered when looking at the primary sources is that Viceroy Linlithgow actually thought it was a good idea that people fled. I mean, he used the word useless mouths. It's better that useless mouths, and he used it of Calcutta as well, that useless mouths leave the city. Whereas he wanted those engaged in war production and in vital services to remain. So the Raj looked at this as if it was a managerial issue, let the inessentials or the non-essentials flee and let the people who want remain, because if the Japanese do attack, then we'd be better placed to sort of manage the city.
Yes, and it was definitely a mismanagement question all the way through. But let's get back to the mixed messaging. There was a lot of contradictory messaging, both from Delhi and from the state capitals, and also from the Indian nationalists at the time. And this created an atmosphere of complete disharmony, complete chaos, if you like. Now, could the management have been done any better at wartime?
Well, I mean, we know now the Japanese had no plans to invade India. We know that all they wanted to do was to create disruption, undermine, British confidence, to maybe turn Indians against the British Empire because they had this idea of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So it was in line with all of that. But we now know that there was no invasion plan. They didn't have even the fleet that Nagumo sailed into the Indian Ocean, which was not, uh, he had 6 aircraft carriers and so on, but it was not enough to invade India and occupy it for a while. So we know now that they didn't have any such plan. But even so, I think one might argue that the British had to be prepared for the worst possibility. I mean, they couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So some of the stuff that they did, particularly the passive defense measures, the air raid precautions, the attempt to sort of augment both men and military material for possible invasion, that was on. But I think what they failed to do was what they did was a number of things. One is that the ARP measures were probably instituted too early. I mean, there were blackouts in cities in 1940, well before Japan had even entered the war. So I think they overdid it a bit. And the messaging was wrong because they kept talking about the threat from Japan being there, but not so serious. And it was not very clear what to make of it. So I think they contributed to the panic, I think, in a considerable manner.
Yes, certainly. But what about the mixed messaging from the nationalists?
I don't know if there was mixed messaging. Well, the entry of Japan certainly divided the Congress. And I think, uh, you know, even if Bose was an outlier, having already gone, and in Germany at the time, um, Gandhi's opposition, I mean, he was opposed to India joining the British war effort because it came from a position of Gandhiji's position of nonviolence. So he didn't, he was just opposed. And Gopal talked about Crips, and I think he was against the Crips mission from day one. I mean, he refused to meet the Crips. He sent Nehru and Azad to meet Crips. And it's only when Crips sought of this thing, he wrote back to him, say, "Oh, you really want to meet me? Okay, I'll do that." So he was opposed to this, and there was reason why he was opposed to this. because of his non-commitment, absolute commitment to non-violence. I think Nehru was more ideological. I think he saw he didn't want the Japanese. I mean, he associated them with fascism and Nazism and so on. So he was opposed to this. He was willing to support the war effort if the British made concessions. Rajaji was able to, I think, took this even further. He was saying, okay, let's just support them because the British are better for us and they will deliver something to us after the war.
Yes, you
So
mentioned,
those
yes.
divisions existed. I'm not sure it was mixed messaging. It was certainly differences of opinion.
Must have been very confusing to the audience. But anyway, you mentioned the fact that the Japanese tried to play on the fact that they were there to liberate captive people, especially in India. And you mentioned in the book that this um, attitude, propaganda, if you like, did have some traction in India. It would be very interesting to know actually what percentage of the population in India was convinced that the Japanese, in fact, the Japanese war effort was a liberation movement rather than occupation movement. Very difficult to
Yeah,
tell, I know.
I'm not sure we had percentages, but there is a passage that Gandhi wrote where he talked about four kinds of Indians in this context. And the fourth category of were the Indians who were sympathetic to Japan. And I can't remember exactly the expression he used, but he suggested that there were a considerable number. We also know that, there were complaints from the British that nobody listened to their radio stations. People were tuning into German stations and so on. So there was undeniable sympathy. I mean,
think
there was a belief that we could be
I
liberated.
think there's a mention in your book that maybe it was in Calcutta that a primer to sort of self-taught
Yes,
Japanese had got sold out. Is that
yes,
right?
yes. There was a fortnightly report which said, one of the consequences of this is that people had started studying Japanese and a primer has been sold out.
Mr. Gandhi mentioned that you had broken new ground in several respects. I can just think of three things which had certainly not come to my notice before. Mr. Gandhi mentioned the zoo animals, which had been unfortunately killed in order to prevent the dangerous animals from escaping or being released. And this wasn't only in India, it was in several other places, as you point out, including London and
Warsaw.
Australia and other places. Then the other aspect which was new to me was the fact that the Japanese had been interned. I think 2000 had been interned in the old fort in Delhi, and that their assets had also been sequestrated. I think, and another aspect which seemed to me to be interesting and novel was the fact that the British and American and other foreign troops which came to India after 1941 during the war um, were a mixed blessing to the population because they were also there were also accusations or insinuations of misbehavior by these troops in regard to Indian women. You point out that much of this perhaps were allegations and unfounded, but it's interesting that this aspect I've not seen before.
Okay, so I don't know where to start, but the zoo.
The zoo.
Uh, um, so it's not. I mean, to be fair, it's not as if the zoo story has never been told before. Maybe I've done it in more detail because I dug up references to the story and got more detail from looking at the Madras Corporation records. There was debate about zoo animals and stuff like that. I don't think those sources were used, but the mere story that those zoo animals were shot were retold by the Corporation Commissioner Pulla Reddy in his book, and so that's very much there. Um, I mean, you mentioned other cities, but interestingly, Alipur, which is zoo, which is just nearby, they sent their so-called dangerous animals away. I imagine the lions and the tigers to another zoo, but they killed what they call the poisonous reptiles, which I imagine were snakes, and they killed and they used another word, dangerous reptiles. I think they meant crocodiles. So I think they did some killing here as well. There's a little. All I could find was a single column in the Statesman about this incident. That's there in the book as a footnote. Um, but yes, I think zoo animals were killed. Pets were killed in England. Large numbers. There's this horrifying book about people queuing to get their pets exterminated because they feared that the humans would come and there'd be no one to look after pets, dogs and cats particularly. It's called the Great Dog Massacre. There's a book on that. So it was a worldwide thing, and this again, what I thought initially was a peculiarly Madras phenomenon, I find was happening in different parts of the world. So
Quite right. And as far as the bad reputation of the foreign troops, they were, I think, at the end of the war, there were about 350,000 in India. But they seem to have had an unsavory reputation, probably wrongly.
So yeah, I think the story is the flap is that there was panic. The panic created rumors. The rumors created further panic, and there was this cycle of rumor and panic and flight that kept happening. And there were rumors about troops, and there were also real worries about troops. People fled because of troops. I mean, in the Central Legislative Assembly, there was, uh, I think, a Bengali representative who says that he just met a woman in Calcutta who says, "I'm not worried about the bombs. I'm worried about the troops. They might rape me." Um, Governor Hope blames Kasturi Srinivasan, who was then the editor of the Hindu, for writing an editorial and which very, very faintly referred to some incidents relating to troops as being responsible for the panic created in Madras about troops. We know that people fled bases in Jamshedpur. People fled with the arrival of the troops and the aircraft gunners, anti-aircraft gunners. So that was the fear was real, but it's possible that some of the incidents couldn't be corroborated, but some of them have been. So they did their mischief. That's what troops do. They also spawned a sex industry, and there are references to that in the book too. There's a surge in prostitution at that time with the arrival of foreign troops. Yeah.
Well, let's just touch on the Japanese who were interned. Did you follow that story to the end of the war? Were they still there at the end of the war?
So they were not in Puranakila at the end of the war. They were moved to another camp called Diara, and then there's this strange division between them because there were people who believed that Japan would prevail, in 45, and there were people who believed that Japan should surrender, and they came to clashes in the camp, and they threw feces at each other, and they did all kinds of crazy things. So they were really they had these brawls, ideological brawls. These people who were interned.
They don't seem to have suffered anything like the privations that the
Well,
Japanese in the United
well,
States suffered, for example.
102 people died. In I think if I remember the numbers in Puranakila,
But
out of Berry and all
right.
kinds of other. So they
Let me be the devil's advocate,
oh,
Mukund. I want to, state in your book quite categorically that this was a flap. It was much ado about nothing. Millions of people were evacuated or evacuated themselves, actually. And there was actually no real risk of any Japanese invasion for reasons you've already mentioned this afternoon. But I want to challenge you on that because in the fog of war, I think that these sophisticated arguments that you use why they could not have been an invasion are really ex post facto. They're really being wise after the event. After all, Singapore, which was supposed to be an impregnable fortress, was certainly occupied. The Andaman Islands were occupied. There were, I think your book says there were 3,000, am I wrong? 300 Japanese aircraft in the Bay of Bengal. Now, Colombo was bombed, so was Trincomalee. So, why do you think it was so obvious that there was going to be no invasion?
so let me start by answering that the latter events you described, the bombing of Colombo, Vishakhapatnam, and so on, that happened fairly late in the history, if that's the right word, of the flap. Okay, the flap began, and people started evacuating Calcutta, starting 1 week after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So there's a report saying from December 30th to 13th to 30th of December 1941. 17% of the population fled. Um, the events you described happened in April, much later. So there was a lot of panic. There was a lot of exodus. There's a lot of confusion before the Japanese actually arrived. So that's one uh, part of I think, the answer to your question. The second part is I do agree. I completely agree with you that you needed to be prepared, and you needed to be prepared for an invasion, even though the British themselves, as in January and February, I mean, Governor Hope was telling the people, there's going to be no invasion. They can't do it. They can't even be a serious air raid because, the nearest air base, which was in Southeast Asia, was so far away.
Let me just clarify that when Mukund speaks of Governor Hope, he's speaking of the governor of Madras.
Correct. Governor of the Madras Presidency, correct.
Well, certainly. In the fog of war, when it's every man for himself, and you have these rumors of people being evacuated elsewhere, that the British or the European communities are leaving the big towns, when you have trenches being dug, when you have civil defense and air raid warnings, you have stories coming from the Far East about Japanese atrocities. When you have refugees coming from Burma and from Ceylon into India, I mean, it's hardly surprising that, I mean, putting yourself or myself in that position, wouldn't we also make for the hills?
Good point. I think there was a lot happening which was, gave cause for fear. But at the same time, I think the British didn't handle it properly in so far as they had extremely mixed messaging. It was not stay calm. I think Rajaji did more of that. That even if they came, we'd be able to handle it and stay calm. I think his message was much clearer right through, because he traveled extensively through the Madras Presidency between January and I think March, uh, talking to people, drawing huge crowds, and I think he was, at least there's clarity in what he said, and he was extremely critical of Hope and his mixed messaging.
Yes, I just think that in many respects, actually, my mother-in-law, who is now 103, and she's still able to narrate some incidents. She was in Calcutta during the war, and she was in next to Allenby Park, which is not far from here, living with her in-laws. She confirms a great deal of what's in your book. She speaks of all her friends, relatives, and acquaintances having been evacuated or being evacuated, evacuating themselves, actually. There was such petrol rationing. There were no cars on the streets. They had to use horse-drawn carriages. There were trenches, there was civil defense, air raid warnings, the refugees from Burma, the whole hysteria. And although she didn't evacuate, nearly everybody she knew had evacuated. And she heard the sound of the Japanese aircraft coming, which she says had a distinct sound, quite different from aircraft from other countries. And she also says there was really no defense in Calcutta. She thinks there was one anti-aircraft gun on the Maidan. She thinks, but she's not sure. She remembers her father-in-law in his civil defense uniform dashing off into the streets, though he was civil defense in not in Calcutta but in Ranchi or somewhere. But her memory serves to confirm everything you've written in your book. I'd just like to say that this is sort of mass hysteria, isn't it? So you don't look for evidence when you consider saving your own skin. You tend to go somewhere else, especially from the coast. What is strange is that there was evacuation from the inland areas also. And where did they go?
So two things. One is there was mass hysteria, and I'm sure that prompted people to go. But Exodus has its own dynamic. The more people leave, the even more people leave. So my mother, for instance, her family decided to stay, but they decided to leave when the milkmen stopped coming. Deliver milk. So that was the last straw. Okay, we're going. So I think there was that as well. The more people left, the more people kept leaving because they didn't have services, they didn't have help. Domestic help was a big problem at that time. So that was one issue I think which was very much there. Sorry, I missed the second part of your question, which was
Also, there was rationing. I mean,
there
there was
was
no
there
food
was
available.
there was there
Yeah,
was rationing, there was food available. I mean, this is not in the book, but I did mention it at the last Lit Fest I was on. Uh, the rava dosa, which is a very popular South Indian dish made of wheat, uh, apparently was invented during the flap because there was not enough rice in Madras at that time. There was wheat scarcity in other places. So yes, it was a time of scarcity at that time.
it was your mother's experience that got you started to think about excavating this kind of
Yeah,
data.
I've lived with that story. I've lived with the story of her going away, of her finishing a whole year in Coimbatore. They were in Madras, coming back where the the British principal of Queen Mary's College refused to let her do the second year for intermediate. So she had to hunt around for a place to do that. And they came back to a house which was completely stripped of everything. There was nothing. She says there was not even a nail because everything had been stripped down. And that was the experience of a lot of people because so many people had fled uh, cities that thieves had a run of the city, at that time.
That's right. And can I ask you, where did you find the data for your book? Where did you start to look for it?
Well, I mean, uh, I think like most people who are looking at contemporary Indian history, I think you can't do without the British Library. So that was a major source. I spent a lot of time at the archives in Delhi as well. Um, the Tamil Nadu archives had stuff on the index, but a lot of what I wanted was apparently moved somewhere else, and I couldn't trace it. There's some secondary sources as well, I mean, in the book. So basically, I think the bulk of the primary work was done either in the Delhi archives or I also went to Bombay to the Municipal Corporation in Madras. So there was that as well. Calcutta. In fact, I was at town hall looking at stuff. Yeah.
Well, you know, most people today would be extremely surprised at the complete lack of intelligence in this story that you portray. Uh, for example, um, it doesn't seem that the Japanese really knew very much about what was happening in India, nor does it seem that the British Raj was very greatly aware of what was happening to the Japanese fleet in the Bay of Bengal. So you've got a situation where everyone was sort of blindly leading each other without knowing actually what was happening. In this day of satellites and telecom interceptions and so on, this is almost unbelievable. It's unbelievable that actually the only city that you described as being formally evacuated was Madras. Everyone else evacuated themselves voluntarily, so to say, in the hysteria. But only Madras had an order of evacuation. And why? Because, well, perhaps you should tell us why.
Well, I mean, Madras had many press communiques, but yes, the final one was issued when uh, there was military intelligence, false military intelligence, that a huge Japanese fleet was going to arrive in a few days, mid-April 1942, to invade some areas south of Madras, but on the southern Tamil Nadu coast now. And he decided that his entire government must disperse. So they went they went everywhere. They went to Anantapur, they went to Bangalore, they went to Salem, they went to Coimbatore. The courts went in one place, the forest department to another. So they scattered. They went to Uti. Um, so that was a huge scattering that the government had, and Hope, I think, argued with some justification that he couldn't be faulted for a false military report, because Hope and a man called General Smollett, as soon as they got this, they actually flew to Bangalore from Madras, confirm whether this was absolutely true and this was happening, and they were told it was true, which is after which that he issued this order. So you probably couldn't fault him um uh, for dispersing the government, but on the other side, as the Mail, which I think has done some remarkable writing. It was a British-owned newspaper, but you know uh, published out of Madras at that time. Asked very snarkily why the government was dispersing. They wanted only inessential people to go, or people who had no business. And so they implied, I just hope, trying to imply that the government had no business in Madras. So that's an interesting point. But yeah, I take your point that uh, maybe Hope had no other option uh, but to see that people left the city if a big fleet, and they had nothing by way of defenses. I mean, as you know, they had things like coconut trees on Marina Beach. They put a large dummy fort on Marina Beach because they thought it would scare away Madras's beach. They'd scare away Jap planes. So they had very little to defend themselves with.
Well, yes. I mean, again, with hindsight, one can say that intelligence was abysmally bad. Maybe, if the worst comes to the worst one day, hopefully not, we'll say that even today's intelligence is very bad, because uh, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But one should never, I think, underestimate mass hysteria. I don't know whether you remember, Mukund, that in 1938, H.G. Wells' famous book, War of the Worlds, the Martians were supposed to be coming to India. Oh, in his book, they come to the world and kind of take over. And H.G. Wells's book was made into a radio program, and Orson Welles was the narrator. And they started with some imaginary radio broadcasts from New York City, saying that the Martians have landed and now, people are panicking, etc. You won't believe this, but 1.5 million people left the town because of these radio broadcasts. So I think that, when you consider this kind of situation, mass hysteria is a very powerful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't know the story, so thank you. But yes, I mean, I think it reinforces your point that there probably was mass hysteria at that time, but maybe it could have been managed a little better. But yeah, point taken.
But anyway, congratulations, Mukund. Very interesting book, as Gopal said. Certainly worth reading and casts a new light entirely on the history of that period. Now, I'm asked to request the audience for a question or two.
Yeah, hi. This is Aditya Basu. I'm like a media producer and publisher. Now, regarding the speculation about Japanese invading India and all that, I think during war times, what happens, a lot of countries actually spread disinformation just to scare the opponent so that resources they try to pile up here in India, maybe that will be reducing war efforts in other parts of the world where the fighting is going on, like what Churchill did while invading Europe. About the Normandy, they speculated they're going to attack in Normandy, but they landed in Munich. So maybe a disinformation campaign by the Japanese was to focus, shift the British war effort towards India and maybe reduce pressure somewhere else. That is one aspect, my personal thoughts. And second is when we are talking about Mr. Subhash Chandra Bose, it's again a misconception that he was, allied with the fascists and all that. It's more or less a thing that Gandhi wanted to promote just to, alienate him. For Subhash Bose, it was nothing but a matter of.
Is there a question
No,
here,
I'm
sir?
just saying, as a patriot, I think it's more a matter of labeling,
Yeah.
political labeling that happened from India. But for Subhash Bose, it was a matter of choice of being
Yeah.
friends with the enemy of the enemy.
Yeah,
He didn't have any other option to fight back.
yeah. I all I said to repeat myself was at that time Subhash Bose was in Germany. Yeah, I didn't use the word. I said Nehru was opposed, had an ideological point about that. So I made that point with reference to what Nehru had said. I used the word. fascism and Nazism. Bose, I said, when I talked about the Congress differences, I said he was an outlier because he was already there. I was talking about the differences between Gandhi, Nehru, and perhaps Rajaji, which sort of manifested itself at that time, particularly after the entry of Japan. Sorry, your first question was about,
Disinformation.
uh, you know, this is the thing. Pearl Harbor was the international headline, right? I mean, films have been made of it, books has been written about. But from Japan's perspective, as I say in the book, Pearl Harbor was just insurance. What they wanted was Southeast Asia. They wanted to take out the American Navy because everything they wanted was in Southeast Asia. The reserves of tin, rubber, everything that they needed to feed their military machine and also to get rich was in Southeast Asia. Similarly, Singapore was important because the British the Eastern Naval Fleet was headquartered there. And they moved to Colombo. They moved to Trincomalee, which is why they came to Trincomalee. It's just lucky for the British that Somerville, who headed that fleet, was in a base that they did not know about. And this is, I think, your point that people didn't have complete information. He happened to be in the Maldives at that time. So they didn't destroy the fleet, as much of the fleet as they hoped to, in the operation in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was known then. Um, I think they wanted to take out the fleet. That was very much there. I think that was not. Uh, yeah, I think there's no argument there that they wanted to sink as many ships. They sank an aircraft carrier off the coast of Batticaloa called the Hermes, which was one of an ancient old British aircraft carrier. They sank destroyers. So they did a proper operation, wanting to take down the British Navy, but they had no plans to invade and occupy. I don't think they had the firepower to do that.
My question is, the topic is very interesting, and the time frame that you have captured, that also sounds interesting. So what I would like to know uh, is there any planned sequel about because the next couple of years, it stops at April 1941, say up to 43, we have the exodus from Burma, and there were actual one or two bombs Japanese dropped in Calcutta. Even there was a famous Bengali poem on
Yeah.
বোম ফেলেছে জাপানি বোমের ভেতর কেউ তেসা ব্রিটিশ বলে বাপরে বাপ. So that came about at that time. So do you plan a sequel? And regarding the difficulty of the archival material, maybe 42, 43, those material would be by now completely declassified.
Yes.
So
So,
can we expect something even more interesting
uh,
happening over the next couple of years, 42, 43?
here's my answer. One is that I said in the main, the book focuses on this area. It does talk about some events that happened in 43. You talk about Calcutta. Calcutta was bombed repeatedly. It was bombed 3 times, almost in succession, in December 1942,
42.
and then again bombed in 1943. And it wasn't a bomb here and there. The Japanese bombed about 14 places. I mean, they bombed Chittagong over and over and over again. They bombed Feni, they bombed Noakhali, the Cox's Bazar. So there was a lot of bombing that happened sporadically, but some of it was aimed at airfields, some of it was aimed. I mean, Vishakhapatnam and Kakinada, for instance, the Vishakhapatnam was a harbor that was attacked. Kakinada was to take out an oil installation. So they were targeting infrastructure, and they were, just trying to create that kind of disruption. Uh, they bombed Impal. Um, so there was a lot of bombing at that time. In Calcutta, the interesting thing is uh, it happened a little late. Chittagong and other areas were bombed much earlier in 42. Calcutta, despite being such an important strategic center, a place for war production, as Lindith Go kept reminding his governor here, Herbert, um, was also possibly the place that if they did invade from Burma, the Japanese, because by then they'd taken Burma, Rangoon had fallen, um, it would become an important center for resistance, against an attack from that quarter. So it's pretty curious fact, in fact, and I think the Statesman, one of the managing editor, also mentions that somewhere, that it's not really clear why Calcutta wasn't bombed earlier. It was the first city that actually panicked in a way, because people left. And the interesting thing is that, and I'm sorry, this is not an answer to your question, but the pattern of the exodus is very similar in places. In many places, particularly cities, it was the non-native business people who left. So in Calcutta, there were certain communities like the Marwadi community and so on that left first. Then people started, women and children were sent away. That was also happened first. I think that was to allow people to remain and earn a living until they thought became impossible. So there was this pattern, and it played out pretty much everywhere. You read the reports, whether it was Madras, Bombay, anywhere else, the similar thing happened.
But thank you very much. It's very encouraging to be asked for a sequel.
Okay.
And I think that that's something that you'd like to appreciate. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mukund.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Krishnan and Mr. Padmanabhan. I would now like to request Sri Gopalkrishna Gandhi